bonjour à tous. Donc, comme on vous l'a dit et vous en êtes aperçu, je ne suis pas Sophie Crass, ce qui est prévu dans le programme. Elle s'excuse pour une raison personnelle. Elle n'a pas pu être parmi nous. Ce qui était prévu, c'était que Sophie présente Cécile Whiting et ne fasse pas la conférence. Donc, je parlerai très très peu de temps et ça nous permet de mieux connaître peut-être le travail de Cécile, que vous connaissez d'ailleurs éventuellement. Ça tombe très bien puisque de toute façon, les deux livres que voulait mettre Sophie en avant, je les ai lus, donc voilà, je me sens assez à l'aise pour le faire. Préciser donc que Cécile Whiting est professeure d'histoire de l'art à l'Université de Californie à Irvine. Elle est spécialiste d'art américain contemporain. Elle a notamment publié plusieurs ouvrages importants dans l'historiographie consacrée au pop art, qui sera l'objet de sa conférence aujourd'hui. Le premier est A Taste for Pop Art, Gender and Consumer Culture, publié chez Cambridge University Press en 1997, qui a contribué à repenser la manière dont le pop art utilisait les stéréotypes et images toutes faites de la culture populaire et commerciale. Et il y a un second livre qui m'est cher personnellement, qui est Pop LA, Art and the City in the 60s, qui a été publié en 2006 aux presses de l'Université de Californie et qui a obtenu d'ailleurs, qui a été récompensé par le prestigieux prix Eldredge. Et qui a renouvelé quand même notre vision du pop art en l'ouvrant bien au-delà des quelques artistes qui lui sont aujourd'hui associés et en montrant combien le pop devait à la culture populaire urbaine de la côte ouest et de Los Angeles en particulier. Donc voilà. Le reste, tu le feras bien mieux que moi. Donc je vais aller m'asseoir et écouter maintenant. Et il y aura un petit temps pour les questions à la fin, c'est ça.
Merci. In the early 1960s, a number of artists, including most famously Andy Warhol and Roy Lichtenstein, whose canvases you are looking at right now, began to represent product labels, comic books, and movie stars on their canvases. They not only featured commercial motifs in their paintings, they also emulated commercial techniques of production and reproduction. The artist's application of commercial techniques resulted in works of art most closely resembling the product labels produced by the assembly line than the surface flourish of paint laid upon the canvas by the hand of the previous generation of abstract expressionists. And here I'm just using a painting by Jackson Pollock to exemplify that. Pop art drew attention to the sort of consumer culture that flourished in the United States after World War II and highlighted the important role of images and brand names in selling goods, politicians, celebrities, and even art. It also challenged the basic precepts of modern art taken for granted in the 1950s. These precepts included the idea that the artist was a tortured soul who repudiated the conventions of society and whose art was unique, handmade, and full of deep meaning. Today, I want to analyze the way in which pop artists, especially Warhol and Lichtenstein, depicted the female face, drawing attention to the female face as a means for expressing romantic anguish and for defining a melodramatic sensibility vital to American popular culture at the time. Borrowing from a popular culture of melodrama, both Lichtenstein and Warhol depicted the female face, but emptied it of emotional affect. Lichtenstein plucked images from romance comic books, extracting single panels from longer narratives and zooming in on the face, stylizing its features. Warhol, working from publicity stills promoting female movie stars performing in Hollywood romantic melodramas, also concentrated on the face, repeating it as a multiple in a number of silkscreens. In the early days of the American feminist movement of the 1960s, Lichtenstein and Warhol highlighted the way in which the female face functioned in popular culture as a screen upon which to project excessive emotions. In so doing, they question the existence of an authentic, natural-born feminine affect. In 1962 and 1963, Roy Lichtenstein painted a series of images derived from war and romance comic books. The paintings not only codify the gender roles that in the comic books are themselves less clearly defined, but they also draw attention to those roles as figured representations. That is, they highlight the manner in which gender differences are rhetorically constructed and not natural-born. Lichtenstein's reliance on comic books has, over the years, been amply documented. We know that Lichtenstein, instead of inventing his scenes, pirated his characters and dialogues from published comic book sources. With few exceptions, Lichtenstein avoided the most famous comic books like Superman and Wonder Woman. He also steered clear of the controversial genres of crime and horror comic books that you see on the far right. There were many people in the 1950s who actually believed that horror comic books caused juvenile delinquency. And subsequently, they were regulated by the law, by a Comics Code authority established in 1954. But Warhol really avoided any of these really famous comic books. Instead, he selected recognizable types and standard scenes from the growing number of war and romance comic books published for a burgeoning teenage audience in the period after World War II. Although comic books directed toward a male audience greatly outnumbered those intended for both sexes or for a specifically female readership, Lichtenstein chose his examples about evenly from both genres, perhaps slightly favoring the romance comic books. Through the scenes that they depict, Lichtenstein's paintings consistently establish a stark difference between gender roles in war and romance comic books. Lichtenstein's war canvases of youthful, clean-shaven men engaged in battle reiterate the way in which war comic books of that era assign their young, action-oriented heroes to inhospitable spaces, treacherous jungles, deserts, oceans, and skies, marked as war zones by the presence of artillery, explosions, tanks, planes, and Nazi and Asian enemies. Lichtenstein's war paintings almost always depict pilots and soldiers, but only as they confront and defeat the enemy. Wham! Of 1963, for instance, presents a panel from the comic book story Star Jockey, which you're seeing on the upper left-hand corner, in which a lone pilot who has been chased, attacked, and disoriented by the enemy, finally turns his jet around and bravely faces his pursuers in a climactic scene of gunfire and explosion. In Wham!, the black and white helmet, its rounded shape and colors imitating the bucket seat and glass bubble of the cockpit, even transform the male body into a sleek mechanical component, indistinguishable from the plane itself. In Lichtenstein's painting, a man, or rather a cyborg, part man, part machine, confronts the enemy decisively. Lichtenstein's romance paintings almost always situate women in domestic settings. Here, the paintings draw lines much more narrowly than in the romance comic books, which position women not exclusively in the home, but also in offices, restaurants, and outdoor spaces such as beaches, backyards, and shopping districts. In the story from the comic book entitled Secret Hearts, from which Lichtenstein lifted the image for the painting Hopeless of 1863, the heroine takes an active role outside the home, capably assisting a man with car repairs, for instance, and she employs the authority of speaking to others in the first-person voice. Lichtenstein, however, selected the final frame of the story in which the heroine retreats to her bedroom to brood to herself in romantic despair. The women in Lichtenstein's romance paintings are caught in the throes of anguish. Almost all of the young middle-class blondes and brunettes in Lichtenstein's paintings Their class status is indicated by their stylish hairdos, manicured fingernails, and trimmed dresses ornamented with a few tasteful jewels, pucker their perked mouths and wrinkle their eyebrows and upturn noses into grimaces of tension and anxiety. In the romance comic books, frames that feature close-up views of the overwrought female face often interrupt extended narratives and indicate a moment of emotional crisis in a developing romance. Facial expressions conveying emotional turmoil serve as the traces of the effects of actions that have taken place elsewhere and testify transparently to the heroine's personal response to romantic crises. Although these stories almost always culminate in the fulfillment of love, they traffic in on the contrast between the virtuous and the villainous woman. Evil, manipulative women lead the men astray, while the heroines experience anguish at the loss of their true loves. The stories tend to resolve in happy endings when the men realize the errors of their ways and smiles replace tears. Lichtenstein's canvases single out the scenes of romantic suffering and exaggerate and flatten the display of overwrought emotion. The artist frequently begins by eliminating from the comic book sources parts of texts, incidental characters, and features of the settings in such a way as to accentuate the tense, anxious female face alone. Whereas a frame from the story Run for Love of 1962 includes a hero hanging onto an overturned boat, a cliff that gives a sense of distance to the shoreline, and text that fills out the story, Lichtenstein's Drowning Girl of 1963 zooms in on the isolated head of the heroine. Surrounded only by the waves and foam of the sea, the woman closes her eyes while tears run down her cheeks. She appears to drown as much in her emotional sorrow as in the threatening waters. Hopeless, which reiterates quite closely the tear-drenched face of a young heroine, does include the complete text from the comic book source. Yet Lichtenstein's painting omits the window curtain in the background and instead fills almost the entire frame with the heroine's tear-streaked face. With the thought bubble narrowed, centered, and lowered next to the head, the heroine's words are more closely associated with her emotional expression. The dialogue bubbles of the romance paintings contain anguished internal thoughts rather than the external directives seen in the war paintings. They expose romantic desires and anxieties, words of empathy, pride, hurt pride, frustration, and despair that seem to overwhelm the heroines. In the romance paintings, the emotionally fraught words neither grant the women mastery over language nor control over their circumstances. Often, in fact, they emphasize the heroine's lack of resolution. The repetition and the ellipsis in it's not an engagement ring of 1961 and the doubling of the M in maybe in the picture on the left of 1965 exaggerate the heroine's hesitations. The unresolved emotional thoughts of Lichtenstein's heroines place them in a state of suspension. Moreover, titles such as Drowning Girl, Crying Girl, Sleeping Girl, Blonde Waiting often describe ongoing passive states. Lichtenstein's transformations of his comic book sources foreground the role of the medium itself in formulating the conventions of female anguish. Lichtenstein's painting Hopeless flattens out the space, replacing the green window curtain and orange wall in the source with a solid red and black background, and radically simplifies and stylizes the heroine's face and costume. The painting transforms the woman's hair from brunette to an unnatural shade of yellow, streaked with broad jet black lines. These same black lines turn the creases in her shirt and bedspread into abstract linear patterns that no longer function as naturalistic shading. Likewise, the black outline draws attention to the teardrops, first and foremost as highly stylized shapes. The most obvious way in which Lichtenstein highlights the medium is in his transformation of the Ben-Day dots. On the comic book page, the tiny, regularly spaced Ben-Day dots used to color and shade areas of the image are individually too small to discern. In Lichtenstein's paintings, the dots, produced with the help of a large metal screen with rows of circular perforations, have grown to such a remarkable size that they visibly pockmark the heroine's face. The painting does not treat the medium as a transparent window onto the heroine's internal emotional state, but rather emphasizes the role of the Ben-Day dots, stylized lines, and bold colors in formulating and exaggerating her posture of despair. In short, the paintings both focus on the heroine's display of romantic anguish and present it as figured artifice, produced by style as much as by facial expression and words. Over and again, Lichtenstein in his paintings, by selecting tense, climactic moments in the narratives when the affects of masculinity and femininity are at their most extreme, polarizes gender roles that are constructed less rigidly in the comic books. Exaggeration, stylization, and emphatic artifice of form and color transforms representations of romantic anguish and masculine bravado into humorous and hyperbolic expressions of gender stereotypes. In particular, Lichtenstein's stylistic alterations accentuate the feminine affect of debilitating emotion and present it as a stylized artifice, at a time when writers such as Betty Friedan were also bringing attention to gender roles. And by the way, the one French book that was widely read in the United States at this time was Simone De Beauvoir's The Second Sex. The characterization of the dissatisfied and trapped suburban housewife described by Friedan in The Feminine Mystique, which was published in 1963 to much acclaim and publicity, touched a nerve. As historian Stephanie Kuntz points out, the chapter called The Sexual Cell in the book generated the most comment from women readers at the time. It examined the way in which advertisements manipulated women to purchase products conforming to a certain image of femininity. Trying to live up to an ideal of femininity resulted, according to Friedan, in women who felt trapped at home, unhappy with their roles as wives and mothers. In a decade when many people were beginning to question in the United States the assumption that gender differences were innate, Lichtenstein exaggerated and parodied gender roles, and through his stylistic choices suggested that melodramatic feminine affect was not natural, something women were born to, but artificial, the product of performance. If Lichtenstein drew attention to romantic anguish of anonymous comic book heroines and treated their expressions of passion as figured representations, Warhol emptied the face of emotions altogether. In the early 1960s, Warhol portrayed famous movie stars Marilyn Monroe and Elizabeth Taylor at a time of heightened crisis in their personal lives. Marilyn Monroe had just committed suicide when Warhol began his series of Monroe silkscreens, while Taylor had almost died of a rare strain of pneumonia. The popular press transformed the personal lives of these celebrities into melodramatic tragedy. But Warhol relied for his sources on publicity stills promoting famous movies in which these women had starred. The movies from which Warhol borrowed publicity stills of Monroe and Taylor all helped to define a romantic melodramatic sensibility in the post-World War II era. Even though Warhol depicted Monroe after her death in 1962, he selected as a model a publicity still of her from the early 1950s when she reached the height of her career as the blonde bombshell in the 1953 film noir Niagara. For his silkscreens of Taylor, he chose a publicity still promoting the 1960 movie Butterfield 8. in which she appears with her teased black hair and sultry smile, and he also depicted Taylor in her most renowned role of 1963 as Cleopatra, using photographic stills published in Life magazine. The genre of the Hollywood melodrama that flourished in the 1950s was preoccupied with American socio-sexual norms and often exposed the tensions of post-war middle-class life in the United States. The melodramatic sensibility defining these films drew from a long history of novels and theater in the United States and permeated much popular culture in the 1950s. Recent scholars who have taken the melodramatic mode seriously suggest that its excessive expressions of sentiment are a means of exploring the underlying contradictions of modern life, engaging moral questions, and creating sympathy for suffering victims. In the Hollywood film of the mid-20th century, we find the same character types as we did in the romance comic books, virtuous and villainous females in the throes of romantic deceit, anguish, and resolution. Filmmakers such as Douglas Sirk, Henry Hathaway, Daniel Mann, and others used music, lighting, and certainly the close-up to punctuate their narrative dramas. The female face, seen close up on the movie screen, revealing passions on its surface, momentarily arrested the development of the story to draw attention to the moral dilemmas faced by the characters. These Hollywood melodramas challenged the many sociological studies of American women in the 1940s and 50s. Sociological expertise underwrote many articles and books published in Popular magazine on the roles, behavior, and happiness of American women. Consider, for example, the photograph that illustrated the article about a modern American wife published in Life magazine in 1961 that you're seeing on the far left. One woman, seen 3 times, performed 3 roles: mother, wife, working woman. That the American woman could be understood as the sum of her divergent activities was a common rhetorical tactic in the literature on femininity. In the photograph from Life, each of the woman's 3 roles was unambiguously designated by its own costume, props, including in one case children, pose, and facial expression. It would seem that this woman could be understood as the sum of her different roles. An advertisement for Bell Telephone published in Look magazine, another very widely read magazine like Life, this is published in 1957, the image on the right, repeats the tactic with brutal forthrightness. Below the 5 smiling faces of a single woman, variously cast as cook, nurse, chauffeur, maid, and wife, was printed the bold-faced caption, clearly addressing a male reader, "This is your wife." Gone from these images is the anguish seen in the romance comic books as women undertook their romantic journey to marriage. Once wed, they appear to assume their various roles with good cheer, precisely the good cheer questioned by Betty Friedan and also the Hollywood melodrama. The roles featured in the publicity stills of Monroe and Taylor chosen by Warhol could in fact be seen as the dark underside of the happy and busy housewife presented by sociologists and advertisers. In Niagara, for instance, Monroe plays a woman who arranges with her lover to kill her husband, a veteran recently discharged from an Army mental hospital after his service in the Korean War. Instead, her husband manages to murder both the wife's lover and, at the end of the film, the wife herself, that is, the character played by Marilyn Monroe. When Warhol depicted Taylor, he referred to 2 films that featured doomed women and blurred the line between Taylor's movie roles and her personal life. In the movie Butterfield 8, for instance, Taylor plays a single woman named Gloria who has an affair with a wealthy married man. He eventually leaves his wife and offers to marry Gloria, but Gloria rejects him, drives off, and dies when her car goes off an embankment. This film, which explored sexual promiscuity, included an appearance by Eddie Fisher as Gloria's childhood friend who counsels her against one-night stands. In the movie, she has a lot of one-night stands. Fisher's presence in the film capitalized on the personal scandal that had erupted the previous year in 1959 when Fisher, whom you see here, divorced Debbie Reynolds to marry Elizabeth Taylor, his best friend's widow. In 1964, Taylor, of course, then divorced Fisher and married Richard Burton, her co-star in Cleopatra, the film from which Warhol borrowed stills to reproduce in his other silkscreens featuring Taylor. Cleopatra was both the most expensive film made and the highest grossing film of 1963, and it explored the entanglements of romance and state power, with Burton and Taylor playing the doomed lovers of Antony and Cleopatra in the struggle between Rome and Egypt. Taylor provided a constant dose of private scandal for the popular press during the filming of Cleopatra. Her diamond necklaces, her $1 million contract for the movie, her affair with co-star Burton, and her near death in 1961 from pneumonia while she was filming Cleopatra. The combined photographs and text published in the popular press flaunted Taylor's capricious personalities, adulteries, marriages, and divorces to the public eye, transforming the private life of this star into public spectacle. As Vogue magazine wrote in 1962 during the production of Cleopatra, quote, "The papers are full of Liz, and the Queen of the Nile coiffure can be felt at least as far north as Paris." So, those of you who were around then may remember. In producing his silkscreens, Warhol avoided sensationalist photographs about the private lives of Monroe and Taylor. At the same time, his pictures drew attention to Hollywood romantic and historical melodramas that flaunted propriety and social convention. The characters played by Monroe and Taylor follow their sexual desires outside the bonds of marriage, and in the case of Cleopatra, pursue political power. Probing the limits of acceptable social and sexual norms for women in mid-20th century America, these characters are ultimately doomed. Warhol, avoiding snapshots about the private lives of the stars, extracted the mass-produced official studio photographs and film stills of Monroe and Taylor from their textual sources, whether newspapers or magazines, and narrowed his attention to the women's faces alone. He silkscreened Monroe's and Taylor's faces as either single or multiple images. The grainy shadows on Monroe's cheek and neck, and the way in which broad streaks of white show through Taylor's hair emulate the low-resolution photographs published at the time in newspapers. Although clearly imitating the popular press and its presentation of movie stars, Warhol exaggerated the appearance and style of both the stars themselves and the mass-produced photographic images by which they were known. Seen in multiple, the facial expressions lose affective impact and fail to convey emotion. If we compare one of the multiples of Monroe to snapshots published in Life magazine of the private Monroe, as we see on the right, we see the differences between Warhol's many Monroes lie in the different colors or graininess of the silkscreen impressions, not in the various emotional states of the sitter. Our impulse may be to read the changing colors or shades of graininess in these images as representations of different moods, but in Warhol's canvases, there is no correlation between differences in color or shadows and the feeling or emotions of his models. Warhol selected psychedelic and metallic colors that, in their newness and artificiality, resist attachment to human emotions. Warhol emphasized the brand name of his stars by minimizing the detail, emphasizing the outline, and exaggerating expression. In Marilyn Monroe, for example, he focused on the surface features by which we recognize the blonde star, her hair, lips, and eyeshadow, which even are exaggerated to the verge of caricature. Monroe's hair resembles a straw yellow cap, sharply outlined, stiffly sculpted, and perched firmly upon her forehead. In a similar spirit, in Liz Taylor, her red lipstick extends prominently beyond the outline of her lips, and her blue-green eyeshadow take the form of two cutout shapes haphazardly pasted across her eyelids and eyebrows. Even the titles of the Monroe and Taylor silkscreens, in which the star's name is qualified by either the number of images within the frame, the predominant color of the canvas, or the size, big or little, of the work, or its date, draw attention to aesthetic processes rather than personality or emotional expression. Both Warhol and Lichtenstein draw attention to gender roles, especially the definition of female affect that were performed ostensibly without self-consciousness in other media forms, whether romance comic books or Hollywood melodrama. By bringing attention to the processes of representation, they emphasized and rendered artificial the melodramatic passions displayed on the female face in the throes of romantic anguish or deceit. Lichtenstein's heroines project emphatically stylized emotional expressions, where Warhol's stars lack affect altogether. In conclusion, I want to briefly touch upon a couple of women artists associated with pop art in the early 1960s who represented not melodramatic heroines, but women in conventional social roles. In so doing, artists such as Niki De Sel and Marisol focused as much as on the body as on the face, yet they, like the male pop artists, denied the face as a screen for the projection of authentic expression and emotion. Unfortunately, a couple of my images can't be read by the computer, but you'll have to believe me there. Marisol was very good friends with Andy Warhol, and there are a lot of photographs of her with Warhol. Marisol was born in Paris of Venezuelan parents, but she worked in New York City, where she was close friends with Warhol. Women and Dog, The Family, and The Wedding are examples of sculptural groups completed by Marisol between 1961 and 1966, in which the artist assumed for herself different roles of women, primarily of the middle and upper middle class. Plaster casts, photographs, or drawings of Marisol's face adorn almost all her blocky female figures, which she constructed from wooden boxes combined with carved heads and legs, contemporary clothing, and accessories. Her figures, herselves, portray brides, grooms, mothers, wives. These women promenade with their families or socialize with other women. Certainly, subtle parodic details undercut the social rules assumed by these women. Plaster casts of buttocks rest on the outside of the dress. A hat covers one mother's eyes, and so forth. In these sculptures, Marisol appropriated and played with various female social identities. However, she did not do so from a distance, for she portrayed her own face and hands in these sculptures. And yet her face revealed nothing. It gave away no clues as to her emotional state. In fact, in the early 1960s, Marisol, the artist, famously withheld her face and voice as signifiers of personality. Although she frequently appeared at parties, socializing with others, or agreed to interviews, she refused access in word or facial expression to her innermost thoughts. She tended to remain without expression and almost silent. Journalist Gloria Steinem, operating on the assumption that the face encoded the self, promised in one article to reveal, quote, Marisol, the face behind the mask. Yet, Gloria Steinem concluded, quote, Marisol's capacity for holding dead seems infinite, and her face is not more open than a cat's, end quote. Marisol's face may appear on all her sculpted women, yet it is emptied of emotional expression or clues to her inner life. Niki De Sel, a French-American artist who worked on both sides of the Atlantic, also took up the conventional social roles of women as brides and mothers in her sculpture in the early 1960s, but she was much more explicit in her critique than was Marisol. She depicted her women as maimed figures, faces absent or crushed. The injured brides and mothers, faces smashed or contorted, have bosoms covered by toy baby dolls, often missing limbs, along with miniature soldiers, toy rifles, and plastic knives. Their physical damage, together with the toys suggestive of violence, allude to the injuries inflicted on them by their social roles as stereotypical brides. In her early assemblage works, mothers and brides play roles straight out of Gothic horror movies, their faces crushed and caricatured. The pop artists, men and women, probed the limits of social and sexual norms for women in the mid-20th century by focusing on the postures and expressions by which they were performed. The artists irrevocably changed the sources from which they borrowed, bringing attention to gender norms taken for granted, whether about social roles or feminine affect. The face, it turns out, played a crucial role in these artworks, not as windows onto the soul, but as a means of defining and defying a repertoire of expressions that were associated with female social roles. Thank you very much for your attention.